Serious, what is your "I was that close to dying" moment? I was 8 years old and it was midsummer and it felt great out in the mornings, so I decided to go do kid stuff outside. I started climbing a tree in my front yard up to the point I had always gone to, but for some reason that day I decided to go as high as I possibly could. The tree was on the part of my lawn past the sidewalk and against the street, and at this point I'm 25 feet above the pavement. I go to grab a branch that was too brittle and fall all 25 feet onto the concrete, snapping my left wrist, cf, getting holes and tears on my lungs, and rupturing my spleen. Before I went into surgery, keep in mind I was 8, I overheard the doctor tell my parents they didn't think I'd survive through the surgery. One of the scariest things a kid could possibly hear. Almost 10 years ago I was suffering from stomach pain. At the time I was drinking vodka daily and didn't have any direction in my life. I was still living at home and it finally came to the point where it was obvious that the drinking wasn't the problem. I went to the hospital and was diagnosed with diverticulitis. I waited so long to be treated that I was as pale as a ghost and required emergency surgery to correct the problem. After all that happened I took better care of myself, but just recently I was taken to the hospital again for severe stomach pains. I required emergency surgery again to correct a hernia that formed and was cutting off blood to my lower intestines. I had to have more of my lower intestines removed to get rid of all the dead tissue. Both experiences were terrible and I felt like I was on my deathbed for both of them. So, when I was about 6, I was at a pool with my mom, aunt and entitled cousin. He wanted to swim on an inflatable alligator I was on, so he just pushed me off it and I was there, drowning at the bottom of the pool. He didn't give a flying fuck about me dying down there. Thank God, my aunt noticed I was gone and that bubbles coming out from water. She then realized what was going on and saved me. Fun fact, my cousin didn't even get grounded for that. I was born with a cleft palate, which is a birth defect that can prevent a child from eating and talking properly and can cause the child to starve to death if the birth defect isn't identified and the child isn't given the correct feeding equipment. The doctor on staff to identify my birth defect had left to play golf right before I was born, and the nurses weren't qualified to diagnose me with a cleft palate and give me the proper feeding equipment. I guess the organization at the hospital was horrible, because about 2.5 days after I was born no one had diagnosed me, and thus I had not been fed. Eventually one of the nurses found out what was going on and fed me using the proper equipment, but because she was not qualified to make that decision she was fired. If I had been allowed to starve for just a few more hours, I would have died. That nurse's decision cost her her job but gave me my life, and anytime I'm considering suicide I remember that. Thank you, whoever you are, for the gift of life. It just shows you how important doing the right thing is, no matter what the repercussions are. Was a theater tech in high school. One of the techs was showing the new girl how to use the fly system, a hanging pipe that you hang things on, clouds, airplane, etc. When you bring the fly down, you yell "fly down." And everyone who hears it echoes it, so everyone quickly knows it's coming down. You also drop it slowly. Well, I was working center stage, right under the fly. She didn't say "fly down" until she had already dropped it, and she just let it fall really fast until it was hip height from the ground. If I would have stepped forward or back, instead of right, I would be dead. Luckily I stepped right and just stared at her. She knew. A few years ago, I thought I got a bad case of strep throat, the usual, felt like swallowing razor blades. Figured I could just muscle my way through it, so I waited it out for a few weeks until it became so severe it was impacting my ability to make it to my college courses. So I finally swallowed my pride, put my wallet on the line, and went to the doctor. Turned out it wasn't strep, I had a peritonsillar abscess at the back of my throat. The doctor said it was the clearest she'd ever seen one, even asked me to let her nurses take a look at it so they could identify it later. Then I got sent off to a doctor in the ER, 2 of his nurses diagnosed it as an abscess, he said it wasn't an abscess, gave me a shot in the butt and sent me on my way. 2 days later, I had to go see an ENT specialist who, again, reiterated that it was one of the largest, ugliest abscesses he'd ever seen and that I was lucky to have made it in time. Another day or two and he told me the abscess would have swollen enough to clog my throat and I would have suffocated. Got it drained, but the abscess became recurrent and I had to get it drained multiple times, more difficult each time. At last, the doctors decided to just cut out my tonsils, and recovery from that was brutal. A few times, I start to cough and bleed out of my throat, try to muscle through it, each time I call the doctor to make sure I'm alright. Finally, they tell me if it happens again, I need to make sure I come in to see the doctor, as it'll be dangerous. Well, less than 12 hours later, My tonsils start bleeding again. I don't have many of the pictures anymore, but my bathroom looked like a murder scene. I was coughing up huge amounts of blood. It got all over the walls, all over the sink, all over the counter and the floor. The ambulance showed up and brought me to the hospital, and they had to give me bags to spit the blood up into, and I filled up like 5 to 6. They had to put me on fluids because it was so bad. Every time it started to coagulate, I'd cough, and the blood would start flowing again, and let me tell you, it's awful. You can feel, and taste, the blood coming up your throat, and the little coagulated chunks only make it worse. They ended up having to put me under and cauterize the wound, and it was a brutal experience all around. Sorry if there are any mistakes, but English is not my first language. Anyway, it was a New Year's Eve 6 years ago and I can remember everything crystal clear. I was with my father and we were heading to some friends to celebrate the new year. Because my father knew he will get shit-faced drunk, we wanted to take a taxi. After about 20 minutes finally a taxi stopped for us. I was about to go in, and in this moment my father just took me from my shirt and threw me 2 meters behind him, and I was like, WTFY. After I got up I just see that a car that was driving with about 100 kilometers crashed into our taxi. Because I was going in at the back seat, if my father hadn't thrown me at the ground I would have fly from the impact and most probably I would have died on New Year's Eve. Yeah, that was my story again, sorry for any mistakes. BTW, this is my first Reddit post and I don't know how to do this, Lamau. I have to. I worked overnights at a department store unloading trucks. We had an indoor bay where the truck pulls right up at floor level. Well, there was something leaning against the door when we opened it and it fell in between the truck and the wall. We told the truck driver to pull forward a few feet so we could get it. I jumped down and heard the brake release. He claimed his foot slipped. Anyway, I heard that and hit the deck. A second later the truck slammed into the wall right where my neck was. A few years ago, working on a construction site, I was working on a chimney. We had to build our own scaffolding for the roof peak because it had a very steep angle. Well, the guy who helped us build it didn't screw down the plank. So when I was on the left side and my coworker was on the right, who's much bigger and heavier than me, it turned into a seesaw. He slipped and I fell over behind him. I was able to get a grab on the chimney, but when I grabbed him, he was too heavy and moving too fast for me to hang on. We both slid down the roof. Luckily, 2x3s were screwed down to the edge of the roof, so if anyone dropped it through, it wouldn't slide off the roof and crush someone's cranium. We were able to stop on it and climb up. Here's the kicker, they were setting the footing for the pool right below. A few hundred pieces of rebar sticking out of the ground. We came pretty close to being human shish kebabs. Long story, but, caught in a riptide in the ocean in Mexico. Waves were slamming me to the bottom, where I'd scratch and claw to keep from being pulled further out. After a couple of cycles where I didn't get a breath before getting slammed again, I started to take water in. Exhausted. No breath. Started to legitimately consider giving up. I pictured my mother sitting on her couch, getting the phone call. It was like a dream, but crystal clear. I heard her get that call. Nope. Not gonna let that happen. Somehow changed my strategy. Get away from the rocks I was drifting toward first, worry about shore second, and that seemed to make the difference. Crawled back onto the shore and have never been as reckless in the ocean since. This was actually completely on me, but I learned from it. I was sitting at stoplight waiting to go forward another 30 yards, where there is a second red light, that is where I turned to the left to get on the highway. As I'm sitting at the red light, the next light turns green and I guess I was on autopilot, so I just yeeted the red light I was at. It was like 5 o'clock on a weekday, the intersection had no business being that empty. I was so lucky that the intersection was empty and there was no cops. Not very interesting, but I sure learned to pay attention as I'm driving. I hadn't been feeling good for a few weeks, but one day after going to the gym, I stopped and got some bibimbap and went home. I woke up in the middle of the night with stomach pain worse than labor. It felt like my guts were being twisted and torn, and it came in waves. I went to the hospital and was told my white blood cell count was high, but go home and come back if it gets worse. I have almost no memory of the next 6 days. My husband said we went back to the hospital when I was laying on the floor screaming in pain, and I had to decide ambulance or car. This is the US. When we got there, I remember I was rushed straight to the back, and the same doc from a few days before admitted me immediately. I spent 6 days in critical care and apparently was quarantined. The only thing they said was that I had some kind of infection, to follow up with a gastroenterologist, and that I probably would have died if my husband hadn't dragged me back in there. It was horrible. So I was shooting a video for my friend, for college presentation. He was using the projector in our classroom and was explaining his PPT, and I was taking a video on my phone. It was almost summer, and so we had turned on the ceiling fans in the classroom. There was nobody else in the room, however. So, everything was going well when suddenly one of the fans' blade just ripped apart and came flying from behind me and just missed my head by barely an inch and then kinda almost pierced through the projector screen. My friend just stopped presenting and just stood there in shock. I was just swearing out loud about how fucking lucky I was.